The first time Petra Callum heard the canary sing, she was standing in the dark hallway of a house that smelled like lavender and old wood and something she couldn't name, something like held breath. And by the time she found the light switch, the singing had stopped. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself birds did things like that. She told herself a lot of things in the weeks that followed, the way people do when they are standing at the edge of something they don't yet have the language to understand. But the bird sang again and again, and never during the day, never casually, never the way birds are supposed to sing, randomly and without agenda, the way the light comes through a window. The canary sang only on certain nights. And the woman who owned it, 81 years old, with silver hair she still pinned up before anyone came to the house, with hands that trembled slightly when she poured tea, but not at all when she was angry. That woman always knew which nights those would be. She would sit in the chair by the window before it began, sometimes hours before, in the dark, waiting, not anxious, not afraid, just waiting, the way someone waits for a train they know is coming, on a platform they've stood on before. Petra would learn much later that Mildred Voss had been waiting on that platform for 19 years. What she kept there, what she kept from every living person who had ever loved her, was the kind of secret that doesn't rot. It preserved itself. It stayed alive in the way that certain grief stays alive, not loudly, not visibly, but steadily, like a pilot light behind a closed door. The canary was named Edison, a small bird, a pale yellow that edged toward cream at the chest, with black eyes that held a quality Petra found hard to describe later when she tried. Not intelligence exactly. Awareness, she said finally, like he was aware more things at once than he should have been. He had lived in Mildred's house for 11 years, a gift from a neighbor who moved away. He had a cage by the front window, and he ate and drank and hopped and did everything a canary does. And for most of his days in that house, he was simply a bird, unremarkable, expected, the kind of presence that becomes part of the background, like a ticking clock or the creak of a floorboard. But on certain nights, Edison sang, not the casual trilling of a healthy bird, not the brief automatic notes of a creature reacting to light or temperature. He sang the way Petra had heard recordings of professional singers sing, fully, completely, as if nothing else existed, as if the song itself was the entire point of being alive. It would begin low, almost uncertain, and then build, and then it would fill the house in a way that felt structurally impossible for a creature that small, as if the sound were coming from the walls themselves. And Mildred would sit in her chair, perfectly still, and listen with her eyes closed. She never explained it. She deflected with the same phrase every time. Birds have their seasons, you know. Just like people. For 6 weeks, that was all Petra had. A phrase that explained nothing, and a bird that sang on nights she couldn't predict. In a house full of rooms that Mildred never entered, in the company of a woman who was one of the most carefully private people Petra had ever met. A woman who had, in 81 years, learned to give nothing away without appearing to withhold anything at all. What Petra didn't know then, what she couldn't have guessed, was that the pattern was already there, that it had always been there, that if she had known what to look for, she would have found it in the first week. She didn't find it in the first week, but she found it eventually. And what she found changed everything she thought she understood about grief, about love, about the strange things that happen in houses where people carry too much alone for too long. Mildred Voss had lived in the house on Hartwell Lane for 54 years. She had moved there as a young wife in the autumn of 1970, with a husband named Carlisle and a daughter named Rowan, who was barely 3 years old and had curly dark hair and the habit of collecting things, bottle caps, smooth stones, colored glass, and lining them up in rows along windowsills. The house was a 2-story colonial with blue shutters that Carlisle repainted every 4 years without fail. and a kitchen window over the sink that faced the back garden, and a third-floor room that they called the study, though no one had ever truly used it for studying, and which remained mostly closed. Carlyle Voss was a quiet man, a structural engineer who worked for the county, who loved jazz records and strong coffee and the newspaper spread over the kitchen table on Sunday mornings, and who had a quality that Mildred valued above almost all others in a person, which was that he never asked her questions she didn't want to answer. He had asked her once, early in their marriage, about the time before they met. A gentle question, genuinely curious. And she had looked at him with something in her eyes that wasn't quite fear, not quite warning, but lived somewhere between the two, and he had nodded once, slowly, and never asked again. That was the agreement between them, never spoken, never formalized, but entirely real. She had brought something into the marriage that he was not permitted to see. He had accepted that. In 41 years together, until his death in 2011, he had kept that acceptance without complaint or resentment, or if he had felt those things, he had kept those too. Their daughter Rowan grew up in the house on Hartwell Lane and inherited her mother's dark hair and her father's quiet patience and a particular kind of loneliness that she didn't understand until she was in her 40s, when she finally began to name it. She lived now in Portland, Oregon, 3 time zones away, and called every Sunday at 7 in the evening, and visited twice a year, and understood her mother the way people understand a painting they've studied for decades without knowing who painted it. Rowan was the one who hired Petra. After Carlyle died, Mildred had managed alone for years, and then she had managed somewhat less well, and then there had been a fall in the kitchen that resulted in a fractured wrist and a 4-day hospital stay. And then Rowan had flown in from Portland and walked through the house and noted the things she hadn't let herself notice on her visits. The faint smell of food left too long on the stove. The prescription bottles she couldn't be certain were being taken correctly, the way her mother moved through the rooms as if saving her energy for something specific and unknown. She hired a home health aide. Her mother agreed with a composure that suggested she had been expecting this conversation for some time and had already decided how she felt about it. Petra Callum arrived on a Tuesday in March, 2 years after Carlyle's death, and she was 34 years old and had been doing this work for 9 years and had cared for 14 different people over that time. And she was good at it. Not just technically, not just in the way that means showing up and completing tasks. She was good at the human part, the part that required reading a person without making them feel read, at being present without crowding, at knowing when to speak and when to simply exist nearby in silence. She had thought she was prepared for Mildred Voss. She was not entirely prepared for Mildred Voss. A woman who opened the door that first morning was composed in a way that felt architectural, as if her composure were load-bearing, as if without it, something would genuinely collapse. She was small and straight-spined, with the careful posture of someone who had been told at an early age that how you held yourself said everything about who you were. Her hair was white and pinned. Her eyes were a gray-green that reminded Petra of winter water, clear and cold and containing depths she couldn't gauge. She invited Petra in. She offered tea. She explained the house in the manner of someone who had given this explanation before and intended to give it exactly once. The kitchen was here. The medications were here. The washing machine was in the basement. The sitting room was for sitting. The study upstairs was not part of Petra's duties. The garden was Mildred's alone, if she wanted it. And then she gestured toward the window, toward the cage there, and said, "That is Edison. He is company. He is not a conversation topic." Petra noted this. She was too experienced to ask a question that early. But she looked at the bird, and the bird looked back at her with those black eyes, and something in the quality of that exchange stayed with her. She couldn't have said why. The first weeks were a negotiation, as they always were. Mildred was not difficult, exactly. She was not rude. She was not demanding in the way some clients were demanding, imperious, requiring constant attention as a form of control. She was simply present in her house in a way that made Petra feel like a guest rather than a caregiver. And there was something subtly effortful about being Petra in that house, about finding the appropriate register, the appropriate distance, the right way to be useful without being intrusive. The house helped in that the house itself was interesting. Not in a beautiful way, exactly, though it was that too, with the dark wood floors and the thick plaster walls, and the garden visible through the rear windows. It was interesting in the way that houses where people have lived deeply and privately are always interesting. The details were specific in ways that made you feel the accumulated weight of decisions made over decades, of a life that had been, even if quietly, eventful. There were photographs on the mantel, not many, not arranged with the enthusiasm of someone who wanted them noticed. 4 or 5 in simple frames, Rowan as a teenager, Carlyle and Mildred at what appeared to be a small ceremony, perhaps a retirement, his hand at her back, both of them with the slightly formal expressions of people who didn't love having their photograph taken. One black and white photograph of a woman Petra didn't recognize, older, severe, who had Mildred's eyes. And one photograph that sat slightly apart from the others, positioned near the edge of the mantel in a spot that seemed, in some indefinable way, deliberate. Not decorative, kept. A photograph of a garden, just a garden, nothing in it that Petra could identify as significant. A rosebush against a stone wall, a light she couldn't place, a corner of what might be a building. No people, no date written on the back. Petra tilted it once and looked. She couldn't help herself. Nothing. She put it back exactly as it had been. She noticed that Mildred watched her do that from the doorway. Neither of them mentioned it. Edison in those early weeks sang not at all. He was active, vocal in the small chattering way of his kind, responded to light and to the sound of the radio, moved around his cage with the busy purposefulness of birds who are healthy. But the singing that Petra had heard described to her by Rowan had mentioned it almost as an afterthought when briefing Petra on the household. He sings sometimes. It's quite something. You'll understand when you hear it. That singing did not come. Petra was, for the first weeks, simply Petra doing her job. Shopping and cooking and managing the medications and driving Mildred to her appointments, the quarterly check with her cardiologist, the monthly visit to her optometrist, sitting with her in the evenings when Mildred permitted it, which was not every evening, learning the shape of the woman slowly, the way you learn a room in a house you're staying in, not all at once, but by moving through it until you stop bumping into things. She learned that Mildred liked her coffee strong and her toast dark and the television off. She learned that Mildred read 2 books a week, reliably, always fiction, always from a small independent bookshop in the town center to which she had been going for 30 years. She learned that Mildred's relationship with the garden was something between a duty and a grief, that she went out there every morning regardless of weather, that she moved among the plants with her hands touching them lightly, that she did not appear to enjoy this exactly, but that she did not appear to be able to stop. She learned that there were rooms Mildred did not enter. Not one room. Rooms. The study at the top of the house, certainly. Mildred had been clear about that. But there was also a room on the 2nd floor, at the end of the hall, that Petra noticed over weeks was never opened. Not locked, not barricaded. Just closed and avoided, in the same way that certain subjects are avoided in conversation. Not from prohibition, but from something older and more personal than prohibition. She didn't ask. She was learning not to ask. The first time Edison sang was on a Thursday night in April. Petra was staying late that evening because Mildred had had an appointment with her cardiologist in the afternoon that had left her tired and slightly unsettled. Nothing serious, the doctor had said, just some adjustments, just some monitoring, But Mildred had come home quieter than usual, and Petra had stayed without being asked. She was in the kitchen when it began. She had been washing the dinner dishes, the radio on low, the window dark against the April night, and then the radio seemed somehow to recede. The way sounds recede when another sound arrives that takes up all the available space. It took her a moment to understand what she was hearing. She turned off the tap. She stood still. Edison was singing. She had heard birds sing her entire life, and this was not like any of it. The sound had a quality she found herself trying to document mentally in real time. The way journalists describe trying to take notes while something enormous is happening, aware that what you're capturing is inadequate to what is occurring. It was complex, layered, containing what felt like phrases that related to each other, that called and responded and built. It was continuous in a way that made her wonder whether the bird was breathing. It was, she thought helplessly, the word arriving before she could interrogate it. It was like an argument, made of sound instead of words, passionate and precise. She walked to the doorway of the sitting room. Mildred was in her chair. Her eyes were closed. Her hands were in her lap, still, the way her hands almost never were. The lamp beside her was off. Only the street light through the window, the very faint orange of it, illuminated the room. And in that light, Mildred's face had a quality that Petra had not seen on it before. A quality that was not peace exactly, but the exterior of something beyond peace. The face that lives on the other side of a very long pain. Petra stood in the doorway and did not enter. The bird sang for perhaps 4 minutes, maybe 5. Then it stopped, as suddenly as it had begun, without the tapering of someone who has finished, with the abruptness of a door closing. The silence it left was not a quiet silence. Mildred's eyes opened. She looked toward the cage. Then she looked toward the doorway where Petra stood. She said nothing. Petra said nothing. After a moment, Mildred said, "I'll be going to bed now." Petra drove home that night with the sound still somewhere in her chest, in the place where heard things live after they've stopped, and she tried for the entire drive to explain to herself what she had witnessed. She tried biology. She tried the day's barometric pressure, which she looked up on her phone at a red light. She tried the idea that the bird was simply healthy, exceptionally healthy, and that he simply sang on some nights and not others. She tried all of it, and none of it made the thing she had seen on Mildred's face go away. She asked Rowan about it. She called her the following Sunday, ostensibly to give the weekly update she was expected to give. And at the end of the call she mentioned it carefully, the way you mention things you want to know more about, without seeming to investigate. Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's done that since we got him. The neighbor who gave him to Mom said he used to do it too." She thought it was a response to something in the environment, a frequency, maybe. Mom never made much of it. "What nights?" Petra asked. "What? What nights does he do it? Is there a pattern?" Rowan paused again, longer this time. "I never thought about that," she said. "I just assumed it was random." "Doesn't it seem random to you?" Petra said, "It doesn't actually." There was a silence between them that held more weight than either of them put into it. She didn't know yet what she was actually saying. She was following something with no name. The way you follow a sound through a dark house, not from courage, but from the particular discomfort of not knowing what it is. She began keeping notes. Not ostentatiously, not in any way that Mildred could see or interpret. A note on her phone, time-stamped, brief. What date, what time the singing began, how long it lasted, what the weather was, where Mildred had been, what she'd done that day, who had called or visited. Anything that might be a variable, anything that might emerge later as significant. Over the following 2 months, Edison sang 4 more times. The first time was on a Tuesday in late April, which meant nothing to Petra then. The second time was on a Saturday in June, And the night before that, Mildred had spent longer than usual in the back garden, coming in just before dark. And when she came in, she went directly upstairs without explanation. And in the morning, she was entirely herself again, slightly more brittle than usual in the way of someone who has slept poorly, but herself. The third time was on a Wednesday in late June, and this time Petra wasn't there. But she knew because Mildred mentioned it the following morning, offhandedly, the way you mention weather. Edison was singing last night, and then moved on immediately, as if she'd said nothing worth noting. The fourth time, Petra was there. The second week of July. A Thursday night again, she noted. The singing lasted 6 minutes, longer than before. And this time, when it stopped and Mildred opened her eyes, there were tears on her face, just a few, tracked into the creases at the corners of her eyes. She didn't move to wipe them. She seemed unaware of them, or beyond caring. She said, "Birds know things." Then she said, "I'd like some water, please." And Petra brought her water and did not ask about the tears. But later that night, she sat in her car in the driveway for 20 minutes before she could bring herself to drive away. And she looked at her notes, the 5 dates. And then she opened the calendar, and she began to look. The date in April, Tuesday the 23rd. She stared at it for a long time. Then she pulled up a search, a slow, directionless search, the kind you make when you don't know exactly what you're looking for, when you're searching for the shape of an answer before you have the question. She searched Mildred Voss. She searched Carlisle Voss. She searched the address on Hartwell Lane. She didn't know what she expected. What she found was not remarkable. The county assessor's records, Carlisle's obituary from 2011, a brief mention of Mildred's name in a church bulletin from 2009, a kind of internet presence an 81-year-old widow in a small town in Connecticut was exactly expected to have. She found nothing that explained the dates. She put her phone away and started the car. She told herself she was being strange. She told herself she was too involved, that she was doing the thing her supervisor had once described to her, the particular professional hazard of caregivers who were good at their job, which was that they sometimes began to feel that the person in their care was a mystery to be solved, rather than a person to be helped. She told herself all of this. She drove home. But the dates stayed with her. They stayed with her all the way through July and into August, when Edison sang again on a night she had been able, for the first time, to predict. She had looked at the calendar and felt something odd and low in her stomach, a kind of pre-recognition, a few days before the date, and she had arranged to be at the house that evening, claiming to Mildred that she'd left something behind and would be stopping by. Mildred had looked at her with those winter water eyes for a moment too long. "Come for supper," she said. "I'll make something." It was the first time Mildred had offered to cook for her. Petra accepted. They ate together at the kitchen table. Mildred made a chicken stew from memory, without looking at a recipe, moving through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had made the same thing hundreds of times. And they ate and spoke about ordinary things. The bookshop had a new display. The garden needed something done with the climbing rose. Rowan had called and seemed well. And then, late in the evening, while they were sitting in the sitting room with the television off, Edison began. Mildred closed her eyes immediately, as if she had been waiting, and this time Petra let herself watch her openly. She watched the slight movement of Mildred's lips, too small to read, as if she were reciting something, or answering something, or just moving her mouth around words she couldn't say aloud. She watched the way Mildred's hands turned upward in her lap, palms open, a posture that looked involuntary, like a reflex. She watched the tears come again. When the singing stopped, there were 2 full minutes of silence. Neither of them moved. And then Mildred turned to Petra with an expression that was the most unguarded Petra had seen on her face in 3 months of daily proximity. She said, My mother used to say that music is just a memory that has learned to make sound. Then she said, I've always thought there was something true in that. She said goodnight. She went upstairs. Petra sat in the sitting room for a long time, the birdcage a pale yellow shape in the dark, Edison perfectly still on his perch. And she thought about what it meant to be a person who lived in a house for 54 years with a memory that had learned to make sound. She thought, something happened in this house, not the bad kind of something. Or not only that, the kind of something that takes a whole life to hold. She was not a woman who read other people's things. She wanted to establish that for herself before what happened next. She had been in 14 homes over 9 years, and she had opened a drawer when asked, and retrieved a document when needed, and replaced a book that had fallen, and she had never read the contents of any of them. Privacy was not just a professional ethic for her. It was something she had been raised to consider genuinely sacred by a mother who had herself come from a family of overly curious people and had overcorrected significantly. So when she found the box, she did not open it, not immediately. The box was on a shelf in the closet of the spare room, not the closed room at the end of the hall, but the properly spare room where extra linens were kept, where she had been looking for a particular tablecloth Mildred had asked about. The box was small, wooden, with a latch, and it sat on the shelf, partially obscured by a folded blanket, and she would not have noticed it except that the blanket had shifted and the edge of the box was visible. She saw it. She looked away. She found the tablecloth. She told herself that was the end of it. For 3 days, it was the end of it. On the 4th day, Mildred had a long appointment, 2 hours away, and Petra was alone in the house, and she went to the spare room for another linens reason, entirely genuine, and the box was still there, and she stood in front of it for a long time. She told herself, this is not yours. She told herself, everything that matters about this woman is already visible in her face, in her garden, in the way she sits when Edison sings. She told herself, this is not your question to answer. And then she reached up and took the box down from the shelf and sat on the edge of the spare bed with it on her knees. She held it without opening it for perhaps 10 minutes. Then she opened it. There were letters, not many, 7, 8, written on paper that had once been white and was now the color of old pages, faintly yellowed along the edges. They were folded in the particular way that letters used to be folded, neatly, exactly, as if the folding itself were part of the communication. She should not have read them. She read one. It was addressed to someone named Mildred Crane, which was Mildred's maiden name, and it was postmarked 1974, which was 4 years after Mildred had moved to Hartwell Lane with Carlyle and young Rowan. And it began, I hope you don't mind me writing. I've thought about it for a long time before I finally decided to. The handwriting was careful, the handwriting of someone who had composed this letter many times before committing it to paper. It said, I was told years ago that you were my birth mother. I want to be clear that I'm not writing to cause you any trouble. I'm not writing to ask anything of you. I just wanted you to know that I am well, that I have a good life, that I understand. The letter was signed, Theodore. Petra held the page very carefully. She looked at the postmark, 1974. She folded the letter back exactly as it had been folded. She placed it back exactly as it had been placed. She put the box back on the shelf, partially behind the blanket, positioned as she had found it. She went to the kitchen and sat down. She sat there for a very long time. Her mind was doing the thing minds do when a piece of information arrives that reorganizes everything preceding it, the way it kept returning to what had been there before the information and could no longer be there now, the way the shape of a room changes when you discover a wall is load-bearing. Mildred had a son she had given up before she married Carlyle, before she moved to Hartwell Lane, before Rowan was born. A son who had found her, who had written to her in 1974, who had signed his letter with a single careful name, Theodore. Who was Theodore now? She did not allow herself to go back to the box. She sat in the kitchen and did not go back. But the question settled into her, and it stayed, and she understood now, sitting in the kitchen of a house that had held this for over half a century, that the shape of the mystery had changed. It was no longer about the bird. Or it was, but the bird was no longer the mystery. The bird was the surface. What lived beneath it was immeasurably older, and heavier, and more human, and Petra had, without meaning to, and without permission, just touched the edge of it. She did not tell Mildred what she had found. This decision cost her something. She was not a person who was comfortable with not telling. She had been raised on the idea that truth in relationships was structural, that when you withheld something significant from someone, you were subtly compromising every moment between you. She felt this now as a kind of low pressure in the chest, a structural complaint. But she also understood, completely, and without requiring further reasoning, that this was not information she was entitled to return to Mildred in the form of a disclosure. Mildred had not invited her into the box. Mildred had not invited her into any of this. Whatever was happening between Mildred and Edison and the certain nights, whatever the architecture of it was, it belonged to Mildred entirely. And Petra was a guest in it, even if an uninvited one. She said nothing. But she looked now differently. She listened differently. She noticed things she had registered before without truly examining. The calendar on the kitchen wall, a simple paper calendar from the bookshop, which Mildred turned to a new month on the first of each month, which had, on certain dates, a small mark. Not a cross, not a circle, not anything legible as a symbol. Just a mark, a slight double line, the kind you might make without lifting the pen properly, the kind that could mean anything. She noticed that the marks fell, roughly, on the months and dates that corresponded to the nights Edison had sung. She noticed that the closet of the room at the end of the hall, the one that was never opened, had a gap at the bottom of the door that sometimes, in certain lights, suggested something on the other side, a density of objects, shelves perhaps, or boxes. She noticed that when Rowan called on Sunday evenings and Mildred held the phone to her ear, her other hand sometimes found its way to the photograph of the garden on the mantel and touched the frame. Just touched it, without seeming aware she was doing it. She noticed that when she had asked Mildred early on why she didn't have her photographs digitized, didn't have them organized into albums or displayed more fully, Mildred had said something odd. She had said, "Some photographs aren't meant to be looked at often. They're meant to be kept." At the time, Petra had taken this for the casual philosophy of an elderly woman with a particular relationship to objects. She had catalogued it as a personality detail. Now she sat with the full weight of it. Some things are meant to be kept. In September, a man named Whitfield Dre arrived. He was 73 years old, which Petra would calculate later, and he drove a blue sedan that he parked carefully in front of the house, and he sat in it for a long time before he got out. Petra saw this from the kitchen window. She was there doing the mid-morning things, and she saw the blue car park, and she saw the man inside and not move for perhaps 10 minutes, and she felt something change in the atmosphere of the house around her. A kind of pressurization, the way the air changes before a storm, not visible, not yet, but unmistakably different. She went to the front door. She opened it before he knocked. He was a tall man, slightly stooped in the way of tall men who have spent decades unconsciously apologizing for their height, with gray hair and a face that had been handsome once and was now interesting in a more complex way, the planes of it having rearranged over decades into something that held more. He was wearing a good coat, not expensive exactly, but chosen. He was holding his hat in his hands, a canvas cap, turning it slightly. He looked at her with gray-green eyes that were the color of winter water. She recognized those eyes. He said, "I'm looking for Mildred Voss. I'm sorry to arrive this way. I wrote several times. I didn't receive a response, and I wasn't certain what to do." Petra said, "Who are you?" He said, "My name is Theodore Whitfield Dre." The inside of the house was absolutely quiet. She heard Edison, somewhere behind her, make a single note. Just one. Not singing. Not the performance she had witnessed. Just one note, clear and brief and certain. The way you say a name when you recognize someone. She made him wait on the porch while she went to speak with Mildred. She found her in the sitting room, in the chair by the window, which meant she had heard the car arrive, which meant she had been sitting there long enough for the atmosphere of the house to have changed around her, and she had stayed in her chair and not come to the door. Mildred was looking at the garden. Petra said, carefully, "There's a man at the door." Mildred said, "Yes." Petra said, "He says his name is Theodore Whitfield Dre." The room was very still. Mildred said, without turning from the window, "I know who he is." Petra waited. Mildred's hands were in her lap, and they were turning slightly against each other, the way they did when she was working through something, not with distress, not with the trembling of illness, but with the deliberate movement of a person consciously deciding something. She said, "He looks like his grandfather." "I imagine." Petra said, "I haven't seen any photographs of his grandfather." Mildred said, "No, you wouldn't have." There was a pause that contained a great deal. Then Mildred turned from the window. She looked at Petra with those eyes, and in them there was something Petra had not seen before. Not quite fear, not quite hope, not quite grief, but some compound of all three that had no separate name, because it almost never exists without the others. She said, "He wrote to me. A year ago, when I was in the hospital. They must have given him the address." She said, "I didn't know what to write back." She said, "I still don't know." She stood from the chair, and it took her a moment to be entirely upright, a small difficulty of 81. But once she was upright, she was very still and very composed, and she said, "Would you stay? In the hall. Would you just stay where I can hear you?" Petra said, "Yes." Mildred walked to the front door. Petra stayed in the hall as she had been asked. She could hear them, not clearly, not every word, but the quality of the exchange, the rhythm of two people finding their register. There were long silences between spoken intervals, silences that didn't feel empty, silences that felt, from where Petra stood, full of the specific weight of things that have never been said and are being approached for the first time. She heard the door open wider. She understood that Mildred was letting him in. They went into the sitting room together. She stayed in the hall. After perhaps 20 minutes, she went to the kitchen to make tea, because she needed something to do with her hands, and because tea was the right thing, and she knew it, and she made a pot and brought it in on the tray with 3 cups, because it seemed right to include herself in the number even though she wasn't sure whether she would be invited. She knocked softly on the sitting room door. Mildred said, "Come in." She brought the tray and set it on the table, and then she stood uncertain by the door, and Mildred gestured at the armchair across from the sofa where Theodore Whitfield Dre was sitting with his canvas hat held in both hands, and she sat. He looked different inside the house. Or she was seeing him differently. He had Mildred's eyes and Mildred's jaw structure, the particular way the chin pointed slightly, and she could see now that what she had read as a dignified reserve in him was something else, something much closer to what she had read in Mildred every day for months, the composure that is load-bearing, the composure that holds something up. He said to Mildred, "I don't want to cause you any difficulty." Mildred said, "You said that in your first letter." In 1974, he looked surprised. He said, "You kept it." She said, I kept all of them. A pause. He said, I came because my wife passed away this year, in March, and I found myself thinking. He paused, not from emotion, she thought, but from the precision of trying to say the exact right thing. I found myself thinking about what it means to run out of time, about what questions remain. Mildred poured tea. She did this with complete composure, steadily, without a drop on the saucer. She said, You had a good life? He said, A good life, yes. A wife, 2 children, 3 grandchildren. I taught secondary school for 35 years. She said, History? He said, surprised again. Music. How did you know? She didn't answer, but her eyes moved briefly, almost imperceptibly, toward Edison's cage. What happened in the hours that followed, Petra would try to reconstruct later, many times, and she would never feel that she had gotten it exactly right, because what happened was not the kind of thing that reconstructs cleanly. It was a conversation between 2 people who were also, in some irreducible sense, strangers, who had spent decades imagining each other, and were now having to reconcile those imaginations with the reality of 2 elderly people in a sitting room in Connecticut, one in a chair by the window, one on the sofa with his hat in his lap. Theodore had been born in 1952 in Boston. Mildred had been 22. She was not married. She was working as a secretary at an architectural firm. She was from Connecticut originally, from a family of the kind of propriety that, in 1952, meant that what had happened, which was not unusual, which was the oldest thing in the world, was also entirely impossible. Her mother had made the arrangements. Everything was handled. Mildred had gone back to work 3 weeks later. She had never told Carlyle. She had never told Rowan. No one living knew. Theodore said, My adoptive parents were good people. They told me early. They were always honest about it. Mildred said, Were you curious? When you were young? He said, Always, but not unhappily. I was curious the way you're curious about a thing you suspect might hurt you. You circle it for a long time. She said, And then you write. He said, And then you write. She said, I'm sorry I never wrote back. He said, I'm not here about that. She looked at him. He said, I came because I wanted you to know that I've had a good life. The same way I wanted to tell you in 1974, and in 1987, and in 2003. I always wrote because I wanted to say, I'm all right. I didn't need you to respond. She said, I know. She said, I always knew. She looked at Edison, at the cage, at the pale yellow bird on his perch, very still. She said, He sang more when you were well. I know how that sounds. But the nights, the years when I didn't hear from you, when the silence meant I didn't know what it meant, those were the quiet years. And then when you wrote, when the letter came and I knew you were still there, still in the world, he would sing, not always right away, sometimes days later, sometimes weeks, but he would sing. Silence. Petra understood, in the most concrete way available, what it means for a room to change. She understood what the photograph of the garden was. She understood what the room at the end of the hall held. She understood what the marks on the calendar meant. She understood what the certain nights were. They were the nights when Mildred allowed herself to know that he was there. The nights when a letter had come, and she had finally read it. Or the nights when a year's silence had broken and been replaced by the terrible tenderness of still being in the same world as someone you had let go. Or the nights when Mildred sat in her chair and did the private thing she had been doing for decades, which was simply to acknowledge, in the only way she had left herself, that Theodore existed, that he was alive, that she had loved him from the beginning, and that love had never required his presence to continue. Edison sang because Mildred sang first, in the only language she permitted herself, which was silence turned inward until it vibrated. Theodore stayed for 3 hours. He had a long drive home, he said. He was staying with his daughter in Providence. Mildred walked him to the door. Petra stayed in the sitting room, not to give them privacy, but because her legs felt faintly unreliable. At the door, she heard Mildred say, "Come back if you want to. Rowan should meet you." "I don't." She paused, and the pause contained 50 years. "I don't know how to do that yet, but I think she would want to." He said, "Whenever you're ready." She said, "I'm 81. I may need to be braver than I expected." He said, and Petra could hear the smile in it, "I'll wait." The door closed. The house was perfectly still. Then Edison began to sing, not the same singing as before, not the 4 or 5 or 6 minutes of complex layered sound that Petra had come to know and to fear and to love in the way you love things you don't entirely understand. This was longer. This was the longest she had ever heard, and it was different in its quality, denser, more deliberate, as if the bird were attempting something that required more than usual, as if the accumulation of everything in this house that had never been released was now, finally, being released through this. Mildred came back to the sitting room. She stood in the doorway. She looked at Edison. She looked at Petra. She said, "He's never done it like this." Petra said, "No." They stood and listened together. The 81-year-old woman in the doorway and the 34-year-old woman in the chair, both of them slightly undone, both of them aware of having witnessed something that they would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain fully to other people. The singing lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, the silence that followed was different from every silence that had preceded it. Not the silence of a held thing. The silence of a thing set down. That autumn was different. Not in the ways that announced themselves. Not in the way that would have been visible to anyone looking in from outside, to the neighbors who waved from driveways, to Rowan when she called on Sundays. It was different in the way of a house that has been under a particular pressure for a very long time, and has then, incrementally, been allowed to breathe. Mildred talked more. Not much more. Not in a way that would have surprised Rowan or made the neighbors notice a change. But she talked more with Petra. She talked in the way of someone who has been economical with words for decades out of necessity and is finding late that the necessity has softened. She talked about her mother, whose name was Cornelia, who had a particular way of arranging flowers and a particular unwillingness to discuss the arrangements she made for other people's lives. She talked about Boston, briefly, once, as if testing the weight of the words, then moved on. She talked about Carlyle. She talked about him in a way she had not before, in the way that reveals rather than curates, and what she revealed was that he had known, not about Theodore specifically, not about the letters or the box or the calendar marks, but he had known that she carried something large and private, and he had chosen her anyway, and that choice, which he had never rescinded and never weaponized, was the most loving thing anyone had ever done for her. She said this to Petra one evening in October, matter-of-factly, the way you state a thing you have always known, but rarely said aloud. She said, "Carlyle never asked. I used to think that was because he was incurious or afraid. Later I understood that it was the greatest gift." Petra said, "Why?" Mildred said, "Because there are things in people that belong only to them. And if you love someone correctly, you love all of them, including the parts you've agreed not to see." She looked at Edison. She said, "I used to be ashamed that I could hear Theodore through that bird. I thought it was." She paused, not for word choice, but to manage something. "I thought it was a madness. That I had manufactured a connection because I needed one, because I hadn't been strong enough to let it go." She said, "Petra, I was 22 years old, and they took him away in 3 weeks, and I went back to work. There was no word in 1952 for what that was. There is barely a word now." Petra said nothing. Mildred said, He's a music teacher. Of course he is. She said, I don't believe in coincidences the way I used to. Rowan came for Thanksgiving. Petra was not there for the conversation, which happened on the first evening. After dinner, while she was back at her own apartment, watching a film she wouldn't remember. She knew it happened because Mildred told her the following morning, briefly, with no ceremony. She said, I told Rowan about Theodore. Petra said, how did that go? Mildred considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She said, she cried. Then she was angry. Then she asked a great many questions. Then she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I need to think. A pause. She said, she's coming back in February with her husband. She's going to call Theodore. I told her where he lives. Petra said, and how do you feel about that? Mildred looked at her with the winter water eyes and said, I feel like a woman who has been holding a door closed for 60 years and has finally let someone else put their hand on the handle. She said, it's different than I expected. She said, it feels like being very, very tired, but the tired way, not the afraid way. She went to the kitchen to make breakfast. Edison turned on his perch, the small, busy movement of a bird adjusting his position, and looked at Petra with those black eyes. She looked back. Theodore came twice more before winter. The second visit was brief, just an afternoon, and Rowan was there, and Petra gave them the house entirely, walking to the bookshop in town and staying for an hour longer than she needed to. When she came back, Mildred and Rowan and Theodore were in the sitting room together. There was a quality in the air of a thing that had been impossible for a long time and had just become, imperfectly, and with great difficulty, and without any guarantee of ease, possible. The third visit was in December, the week before Christmas, and Theodore brought his daughter, a woman of about 40 named Miriam, who had her father's eyes and her own fierce composure, and who looked at Mildred the way you look at something you've been hearing about your whole life. She sat beside her father on the sofa, and she held his hand, which she seemed to do without being aware of it. And she was not warm exactly, but she was present. And Mildred, Petra noticed, seemed to understand that presence as the kind of offering it was. That night, after everyone had gone, Mildred sat for a long time in her chair. Edison did not sing. Petra was washing up in the kitchen, listening to the silence, which was a different silence now, the silence of someone who has done something enormous and is taking stock. Mildred called from the sitting room, Petra. Petra came to the door. Mildred said, there's something in the room upstairs. The room at the end of the hall. There's a box up there. I'd like you to bring it down. Petra said, the room at the end. Mildred said, yes, that one. She brought the key from the kitchen drawer, a small brass key, and handed it to Petra without ceremony. And Petra went upstairs, and the door opened easily, as if it had been waiting, and inside was exactly what she had imagined. Shelves of boxes, organized with the system of someone who had arranged these things many times in their mind. And on the top shelf, a box that was different from the others, newer, wooden, with a latch. She brought it down. Mildred opened it at the kitchen table. Inside were all of Theodore's letters. Not just the one Petra had read months ago, and not just the others in the smaller box in the spare room. All of them. There were 11. From 1974 to the most recent, written in January of this year, a few months before Mildred's hospitalization, a letter that said, I hope you're well. I've been thinking about you this winter. I don't have a particular reason for writing. Some years I just need to. And the last letter, the one that had arrived a year ago at the hospital, which was the one Theodore had mentioned, which said, I heard you were unwell. I drove as far as Connecticut before I turned around. I didn't want to upset you. I hope you recover fully. I hope you know that you have always been. And here the careful handwriting slowed slightly. Petra could see it, the slight change in pressure, someone I think about." Mildred looked at the letters for a long time. She said, "I never wrote back. I never wrote back once in 50 years. Petra said, "You kept every letter." Mildred said, "Yes." She said, "I think he knew." She said, "I think that was enough." Winter settled over Hartwell Lane in the way Connecticut winters do, deliberately and without apology. The house was warmer than it had been, not the temperature of it, but something else, some interior quality. Rowan called twice a week now instead of once. There were plans being made, quietly, for the spring. Theodore had suggested, through Rowan, a lunch. Somewhere neutral. Somewhere without the weight of either person's house. Mildred had agreed. She was, Petra noticed, not at peace. Peace was perhaps the wrong aspiration for a woman who had lived 81 years with the particular burden she had lived with, who had finally, at this late stage, begun to set it down. What she was instead was lighter. Not unburdened, but less compressed. The way a room feels after a window has been opened. Edison sang once more in January. A quiet night, cold, the garden under snow. He sang for 7 minutes, and Mildred sat in her chair with her eyes closed, and this time, when the singing stopped, she smiled. Not a smile of joy exactly. A smile of acknowledgement. The smile you give to something that has accompanied you for a very long time. That has done its work, and that you are beginning to release. She opened her eyes and looked at the bird. She said, "Good boy." That was all. Mildred Voss died in February, 3 weeks after Rowan's visit. Not from any emergency, not from the crisis that the cardiologist had been cautiously monitoring. She died in the way that sometimes happens, in the night, quietly, in her own bed, in a house she had lived in for 54 years. She had cooked dinner the night before. She had talked with Petra for over an hour about the spring plans, the lunch with Theodore, the rose in the garden that needed attention. She had told Petra, near the end of that conversation, that she was not afraid. She said it the way you say things that are true, but that you have never said aloud before, carefully, testing the weight. She said, "I've been afraid for a long time. Of what would happen if anyone knew. Of what it meant about me. Of what I missed. Of what I gave away." She said, "I'm not afraid anymore." Petra had said, "I know." She had said, "I can tell." The funeral was small, the way Mildred had always been small in her public life, contained and specific, attended by the people who had known her for decades, and by Rowan, who stood at the front of the church and looked at the casket with the face of someone who has learned, very recently, that the person in it was larger than she knew. Theodore was there. He stood in the back. He did not introduce himself. He stood with his canvas hat in his hands, turning it slightly, and he looked at the front of the church. And when it was over, he walked out quietly and got into his blue sedan and sat in it for a long time before he drove away. Rowan found him there. She tapped on the window. She said, "I know who you are." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm glad she told me." He said, "So am I." She stood beside the car in the February cold. Two people who were strangers and were not strangers, who had the same mother and had never been in the same room before the past 6 months, who were standing beside each other in a parking lot in Connecticut in winter, having one of the most important conversations either of them would ever have, speaking about ordinary things, about the drive back, about the cold, about their families, carefully, gently, the way you begin. Rowan took Edison. She took him back to Portland, in his cage, on the plane, in a carrier that Petra helped her obtain from the veterinarian. He was healthy, the vet confirmed. Healthy and, for a bird of his age, remarkably robust. Rowan was slightly uncertain about the logistical reality of traveling with a canary, but Petra told her she could do it. And she could, and she did. The last time Petra was at the house, clearing the final items before it went on the market. She stood in the sitting room where Edison's cage had been and looked at the window and the faint circle of light that fell through it, the spot where the cage had sat for 11 years. The house was silent in the way empty houses are silent, differently from the silence it had held when Mildred was in it, a silence without breath in it, without the particular quiet of a person who is listening for something. She looked at the mantel. The photographs had been packed. The spot where the photograph of the garden had sat was empty. She found it in the last box, the one she was sealing, and she looked at it one final time. The garden, the rose bush, the corner of a building. And now she recognized what the corner of the building was. She had walked past it enough times. It was the corner of this house, the back left corner of Hartwell Lane. The photograph had been taken from the garden of this house, from the spot where Mildred stood every morning with her hands on the plants, touching them. The photograph wasn't of a garden somewhere else. It was of this garden. She had kept a photograph of her own garden, not as a record, not as decoration, as a reminder of the life she had built, of the years she had lived in it, of the house that had held her. Petra carried the box to her car. She drove down Hartwell Lane. She looked at the blue shutters, which needed painting again, which Carlyle was not here to paint. She thought about what Mildred had said about birds having their seasons, just like people. She thought about the photograph, about the letters in their box, about an 11-year-old Canary in a carrier on a plane to Portland, his small black eyes, his pale yellow chest, his sound that filled a room in a way that seemed structurally impossible. She thought about Theodore, standing in the back of the church with his hat in his hands, the eyes he had inherited from a woman he had met twice. She thought about Rowan, who had flown in from Portland and walked through her mother's house and found out, in the last months of a life that had always seemed complete to her, that the life was larger than she knew. She thought about the certain nights and what they had been, and what had moved through this ordinary house on those nights. Not a ghost, not a miracle, not anything that required a word outside the ordinary ones. Love, memory, longing, the irreducible persistence of a person you brought into the world and never stopped being responsible to, even when you had agreed with yourself that you had let go. And she thought about Mildred in her chair, in the dark, with her eyes closed and her palms open, receiving, the way some people receive. Finally, after everything, not joy, not resolution, but something quieter and more essential, the knowledge that the thing they carried was real, that it counted, that the bird knew. Rowan called Petra in April, 3 months after the funeral. She said, "You need to hear this." She held her phone up, and Petra listened, standing in her kitchen in the afternoon, to the sound of Edison singing. Not the way he had sung at Hartwell Lane, not the weighted, complicated music of a house full of secret years. Something different. Lighter, cleaner, the sound of a bird settling into a new space and finding, in it, something worth singing about. Rowan came back on the line. She said, "He started 2 days ago. I don't know why. I don't know what night it was." She said, "But I checked the date." Pause. She said, "It was Theodore's birthday." Petra sat down. Rowan said, "I called him. I told him." I don't think he knew what to do with that information. Neither do I, honestly. She said, "But I thought you should know." They sat on the phone together for a moment. Two women who had both been changed by the same house, by the same woman, by the same small pale bird who had spent 11 years singing on certain nights and had never once, in all of that time, been wrong. Rowan said, "I think he's going to be fine here." Petra said, "I think so too." She sat in her kitchen for a long time after the call ended. Outside, the April light was coming through the window the way it does in that month. Tentative, practicing, the particular light that belongs to beginnings. She thought about a woman who had lived with a secret for 60 years. She thought about the impossible privacy of grief. She thought about what it means to love someone from a distance so absolute that the only channel available is silence, and what it means for that silence, over decades, to find its own frequency. She thought about the certain nights. She thought they were never about the bird. They were about a woman who had agreed, without being asked, to disappear from her own love, who had made herself small and quiet and unavailable to what she felt, because the world of 1952 had required it, and who had found, in a small cage by a window in a house on Hartwell Lane, a creature that seemed, improbably, to understand. Not the bird, she thought. The love was what sang. The bird was just the only living thing in that house willing to say so. Edison is still alive. He lives in Portland now, in Rowan's house, in a room with a window that faces east. He sings sometimes, not often, not on every night or every season. He sings on certain nights, and Rowan has stopped trying to predict them and has started, instead, simply listening when they come. Theodore visited Portland once. He will visit again. A lunch that was planned for the spring happened, eventually, in June, at a place with outdoor tables and a garden view, and there were 4 of them, Rowan and her husband, Theodore, and his daughter Miriam. They ate for 3 hours. They talked about things that were ordinary and things that were not. When it was over, Rowan stood in the parking lot and watched Theodore's car until she couldn't see it anymore, and then she stood there a little longer. The room at the end of the hall in Hartwell Lane was empty by the time the house sold. Rowan had taken the boxes herself, carefully, over 2 days. A photograph of the garden is on Rowan's mantel now, in Portland, in a spot that is slightly apart from the other photographs. She has not asked herself why she placed it there. She doesn't need to. Some things are meant to be kept. And on a night in October, in a room in Portland where the window faces east and an old canary sits on his perch in the dark, Rowan woke from sleep to the sound of singing, and she lay still and listened, and she did not cry, exactly. But her face did the thing that faces do when they are receiving something they have been waiting for, without knowing they were waiting. And in the morning, she called her brother for the first time without waiting for him to call first. She said, "It was a long night, but a good one." He said, "I know. I was awake too." She said, "How did you know?" He said, "I don't know how I knew. I just did." He said, "I think maybe that's what family is. After everything, the knowing without knowing how." She held the phone. Outside her window, in the October morning, the light was coming in thin and pale and clean. She said, "I think Mom would have liked hearing you say that." And there was a silence between them, not the silence of held things, not the silence of a house in which a secret has lived for 60 years, but the silence of 2 people who have found each other at the end of a very long road and are standing together in it briefly before the next thing begins. And in the other room, for no reason anyone could name, for no reason anyone would ever be able to fully explain, Edison sang.